MGM removed an 11-minute segment from Forbidden Planet in 1956 that was never supposed to be seen in theaters.
And Frances and her pet tiger were in the scene. Something about innocence, power, and an old story made the censors go crazy.
For a long time, just a few people knew it was there. The scene showed why the tiger suddenly attacked Altaira after their first kiss. But people in the 1950s didn't like the explanation very much.
What MGM hid shows a disturbing secret about what the movie really means. Two matte painters who had never written a script before strolled into MGM in 1952 with a scenario they dubbed Fatal Planet.
People didn't take Irving Bloch and Alan Adler seriously. Back then, science fiction was seen as a place for companies to send their leftover performers and reuse monster outfits.
But their pitch had music, something other. It came from two guys who didn't think in words, they thought in pictures. They didn't just see a planet as a place, they regarded it as a blank slate for dread, wonder, silence, and technology.
At first, MGM threw it away, but something about it stuck with them. The tide had turned by 1954.
The directors of studios were no longer ignoring the rise of television or the growing interest in space.
MGM took a chance and looked at it again.
That dusty pitch was taken out of a drawer and slowly turned into what would become Forbidden Planet.
One of the most costly science fiction experiments of its time. MGM didn't simply say yes to it, they put money on it.
Between $1.9 million and $2 million went into a genre that normally only gets by with $150,000 to $500,000.
The studio wasn't only trying to develop a science fiction movie. They wanted to raise it.
They made the set designs from scratch. The cast wasn't made up of fading B-list actors, instead, it had up-and-coming talents like Leslie Nielsen and in music, Frances, along with the serious Walter Pidgeon. Every dollar went into making a type of music that no one liked into something that people couldn't stop staring at. The industry stopped for a second because MGM made such a bold choice. Was it a stupid risk or a new chance? Even at MGM, many talked quietly about how much it would cost. But the risk paid off.
It didn't only get its money back. It altered how studios thought about science fiction by teaching them that stars didn't have to be cheap to shine. The narrative was first set in the year 1972.
But the technology in the narrative seemed too crazy and out there to be close to the real time frame. They threw the story 200 years into the future, where it landed on a faraway world called Altair 4 in the 23rd century. The main story took a lot of ideas from Shakespeare's The Tempest. Dr. Morbius became a prosperous person in the future.
His daughter Altaira took Miranda's place. It wasn't simply monsters that were monsters.
The human mind formed them, and they came from the subconscious like Shakespeare's spirits of vengeance.
The picture stood out because of its modest mix of high art and lowbrow genre.
There were more than simply lasers and spacecraft.
It was about power, ego, control, and terror that were so deep in the brain that even the stars couldn't get away from them. Fred M. was given the responsibility of directing by MGM.
Wilcox, who had never worked on a sci-fi project before. Lassie Come Home was his most famous work.
People were surprised, but MGM didn't want a visionary to change the genre. They needed someone who could oversee a big cast, a big set, and a tight timeline with discipline. Wilcox came through.
His point of view from the outside made things seem weirder in a good way.
He didn't shoot it like a science fiction movie.
He shot it like it was Shakespeare in the sky. There were no jokes, no winks to the camera, and no nods to the audience.
He took it seriously.
That gravity helped keep the strange story grounded. He allowed the special effects breathe, yet he never lost sight of the story's main characters.
Cyril Hume, the screenwriter, changed the script. He took Bloch and Adler's idea and made it into something more meaningful.
Freudian psychology started to show up. The creatures were no longer just hazards to the body. Dr. Morbius himself came up with the ideas for them as emblems of repression and yearning.
Hume didn't only write conversations.
He added layers of myth, literature, and psychology. The story brought back memories of prior pain and dread of power, as well as the idea that knowledge may kill you.
It wasn't only about aliens. It was about the dark parts of the human psyche that were hidden behind a curtain of technological machinery. Walter Pidgeon was 58 years old when MGM invited him to portray the part of Dr. Morbius. He had been portraying dignified characters in high-quality dramas for decades. He didn't know what sci-fi was. He almost said no. The type of music didn't influence his mind. There was a $1.9 million production with a script that was like The Tempest. Pidgeon noticed the story at Wait. It wasn't a camp. It was a warning. He took the part. He made the movie more serious by doing that. He kept the craziness in check. And Frances, who was barely 23 at the time, strolled onto the scene in what would subsequently be termed the first miniskirt in a movie. Helen Rose made her outfits, which were frightening. They came out approximately 10 years before Mary Quant's big fashion break. The bosses were worried. The movie was banned in Spain until 1967. The conservative theaters pulled out, but the look stayed. Altaira became a symbol, not just for her beauty, but also for how she didn't do what others thought she would. Frances didn't just dress the future, she became a part of it. Leslie Nielsen was Commander Adams, the crew's stern moral leader. He was the straight man before he became recognized for comedy. He was very powerful in Forbidden Planet. He looked like he should be on the bridge of a spaceship. His part was a hint of what would ultimately become Captain Kirk. Later, Nielsen quipped that Robbie the Robot was the true star. In a way, he was correct. Warren Stevens as Doc Oro, the person who discovered it out too late. Monsters were his last words. In 1956, monsters from the ID came down like a hammer. Most people in the crowd didn't even know what the ID was, but they could feel it. His character died off-screen, quietly, and in a scary way. He tried to utilize the Krell's old machine, but it broke him. Stevens said it all in a calm voice that made it worse. There was no monster out there. It was in there. Robbie the Robot didn't talk for himself. Marvin Miller gave him his voice, but no one gave him credit. Frankie Darro, a stuntman, was inside the outfit. Darro didn't endure very long. He almost fell over during the scene after having a few beers at lunch, so they let him leave. But the voice and the movement came together nevertheless. And Robbie lived on forever. He wasn't just a robot. He was charming. He was a different kind of person. Kind, dangerous, and mysterious. The movie's first showing wasn't even in Hollywood. The Southeastern Science Fiction Convention took place in Charlotte on March 3 and 4, 1956. On March 23, Hollywood came to Grauman's Chinese Theater. That kind of rollout didn't happen very often for a genre film. Most sci-fi movies started off quietly and then moved to late-night showings. Forbidden Planet, on the other hand, opened with cinemascope and stereo sound. At Grauman's, it ran for 6 months. MGM acted like it was an epic. When the credits for the music came on, they didn't state score by. They labeled it Electronic Tonalities by Lewis and Baby Baron instead. The union guidelines said they couldn't be credited as composers. The Baroness didn't play any instruments. They made circuits. They made music by breaking objects. Feedback, loops, and static. Their music wasn't up to 1956 standards, yet it rewrote the rules regardless. There were mixed reviews. Some people who didn't like it didn't know what to think. The New Yorker thought it was funny. British reviews were kind, but they were still confused. The Shakespeare, the psychology, and the creatures didn't go together very well. Some people saw brilliance, while others just saw robots in color. But the misunderstanding didn't stop the movie from getting better. It didn't need to be approved right away. It was made to last. The movie made $1.53 million in the US and Canada and between $1.2 million and $35 million in other countries. That brought the total to just about $3 million, with a small profit of $210,000. Not a bomb, but not the hit that MGM had hoped for. It was the 30th highest grossing American movie of 1956. Good. But the stats didn't tell the whole story. Later on, what mattered came. It was nominated for Outstanding Special Effects at the 29th Academy Awards in 1957. It didn't win. The Ten Commandments won. But Forbidden Planet didn't need the prize. It drew its monster with light. The skies were painted. Its results were useful, made by hand, and odd. The nomination for the award showed that things had changed. There was a sequence in Forbidden Planet that sought to convey something that people never really got. It was calm, symbolic, and creepy. Dr. Ostro said something about Altaira and her tiger about the 11th minute. He said that only a virgin could control a unicorn. He also observed something like that in how Altaira, music, could stroke and control a full-grown tiger without being afraid. That scene didn't make it into the final version. MGM chopped it off clean. Back then, the movie production code thought the virgin unicorn metaphor was too provocative. The belief that a woman's sexual purity granted her magical control over animals. They couldn't let that get to theaters in 1956. Altaira's tiger attacks her after she kisses Commander Adams for the first time. It doesn't think twice. The animal that used to lie next to her happily now regards her as a threat. There is no explanation in the final cut of the movie. It seems like a random act of violence, but it wasn't. The scene that was cut would have made it apparent that kiss, that one moment of romantic awakening, marked the end of her control over the beast. Like in those old stories when the unicorn runs away as soon as innocence is lost. It's not simply dangerous when the tiger lunges. It's about loss, change, and something that can't be changed. For a long time, that scene only existed in a book. Philip MacDonald wrote the novelization of Forbidden Planet under the pen name W.J. Stewart. It came out in 1956, before the movie ever came out. It retained the line of unicorns. It spelled it out word for word. How the tiger was kept in check by Altaira's purity. Most folks who read the book thought it was just a creative touch. They didn't know that the scene had been filmed and then hidden. For almost 20 years, no one outside of MGM saw any proof that it had ever been filmed. There was a rule at MGM. Get rid of all the work prints. They didn't want other copies of their film to be out there. They didn't want the public to see raw wounds. But for some reason, Forbidden Planet got through. In 1977, the old work print of Music was found in an ancient archive. It had the scene with the unicorn. It had multiple takes, different lines of conversation, and unedited sound. No one knows for sure why it, song, was saved. Someone might have forgotten. Someone might not have been able to bring themselves to burn it, but it lived on. And when it came back, it changed everything. That work print been fixed. It first appeared on a Criterion Laserdisc. Then there was the DVD for the 50th anniversary, and then there was the Blu-ray. Fans who had grown up seeing the movie version finally saw what Music had been lacking. The kiss, the tiger, and the story. It all made sense. Altaira wasn't just a space ingenue. She was a walking metaphor. Her story was full with layers of innocence, sexuality, and the limits that Hollywood wasn't ready to cross. And there was one more event that caused trouble in 1956. Altair had a sequence where she swam by herself, drifting across the water like a dream. It looked like she wasn't wearing anything. Word got around quickly. And Frances is naked in a sci-fi movie. But she wasn't. She had on a bodysuit that matched her skin tone. It was thin and smooth, and it was deliberately made to look like bare flesh when light hit it and water rippled. The trick worked too well. People in the audience were angry. Groups that care about morality submitted scathing letters. Some cinemas stopped showing the movie. MGM had to make public pronouncements about Music. They said, no, and Frances was never naked. No, nothing inappropriate happened. But others didn't believe them. They couldn't believe it was only the way the light hit it and the way the camera was set up. George Foley, the cinematographer, used exact lighting, kept shadows out of the frame, prevented seams, and let the water reflection obscure the boundaries of the outfit.
He made a bodysuit into a scandal in music.
The team was really surprised at how authentic it appeared. MGM wanted to push the limits without going too far. They figured out how to do both.
When MGM sought to re-release the movie as a cat matinee in 1972, they deleted more than 6 minutes. The scene where they swim was gone. There were also a few flirty interactions.
Anything that is too provocative.
The version that came out in theaters that year was rated G, but it didn't have what made the movie stand out.
Kids have been listening to the tame version of Song for years.
People didn't get to watch the original and censored version again for a long time.
Spain didn't let the movie show at all.
There was a prohibition on Forbidden Planet there for more than 10 years.
Franco's Spanish censors didn't like in Francis's miniskirts or the bathing scene.
It wasn't the creatures, the words, or the spaceship.
The outfits were the problem.
Her skirts were too short, and her body was too easy to see.
In Spain, the movie didn't come out until 1967.
By then, it was already a classic in other places, but in Spain, it was still seen as risky. And Francis was going to wear something even more modest.
Helen Rose, the costume designer for MGM, made a silver lane jumpsuit that covered her from the neck down.
It even came with gloves, a hood, and shoes that you could see through. Dorscherry, the head of MGM's music studio, saw it and said, "No, too revealing." He also added, "Too sexy."
Even though it didn't show any flesh, it was tight. It shone. That was enough to make it not okay.
There was never a film of the jumpsuit. There are only images of the costume test.
There was a technological achievement that most people didn't recognize behind all the drama and hyperbole. The desert in the background wasn't genuine.
A 350-foot-long cyclorama, or curved picture, hung on stage 15.
It looked like an extraterrestrial world that went on and on. But the lighting had to be just right.
The painted sun in the background has to look like the fake sun that was used on stage.
The illusion fell apart if the angles weren't right.
Fully lighted that painting with 40 skylights, each with 10 1000W bulbs, as well as 96K10S and 192K5S. These lights used so much power that they had to run extra lines from other stages.
That one backdrop needed a lot of electricians. Then the spaceship showed up.
Arthur Altaira made a 51-foot wide flying saucer that filled the whole set. It was 167 feet wide, which is about the same size as an actual structure.
It was too much for the cast. When MGM executives came on the set, they instantly raised the budget.
The movie cost $2 million in the end.
That was something that had never happened before in a science fiction movie.
But the spaceship wasn't just a prop.
It was a promise.
It made things more dangerous.
It made everyone do their best. 4 of MGM's biggest soundstages were employed.
Before this movie, no other movie had done that.
Each one held a distinct portion of the world.
The starship, the Krell lab,
the control center, and the alien landscape. The steps all happened at the same time. Crews worked in shifts that overlapped, building, filming, and pulling down. It was always changing.
The requirements were tough, and everything had to be done perfectly.
This wasn't just another movie in a certain genre.
It was a building site for music that was wrapped around a notion of another world. They put together a 16-foot plexiglass globe inside the spaceship. There were shining steel bands flowing through the outer and interior shells.
It mirrored everything.
Everything in the room, including the lights, cameras, and crew, bounced off that globe. They had to cover up lights, equipment, and people, and block glare to acquire one usable shot.
Setting up one viewpoint takes hours.
The globe became a beautiful nightmare on set.
The Krell lab came next.
There were more than simply wires and lights. There were 50,000 feet of cable, 12,500 feet of neon tubing, and more than 1 square yard of plexiglass.
There were 15 electricians on the music crew.
They used 110 different switches to make the panels blink, the lights flash, and the circuits pulse like they were alive. They had to run cables from other stages because the power needs were so high. And every switch made a difference.
In the middle of the scene, they changed hues. They changed the pulses. It seemed like smart aliens, but it was only hard work by people. In Forbidden Planet, everything was bigger than it looked. The missing sequences, the hidden analogies, the clothes that ignited riots, the sets that depleted power systems. For a long time, people viewed the film without knowing what they were missing. But those holes, those subtle erasers, are what made its finding feel like accessing a locked room. MGM spent $125,000 in 1956 to construct just one robot. Robbie was that robot. He wasn't just a background gadget. He was the main part. The expense took up 7% of the whole $1.9 million budget for Forbidden Music Planet. Most sci-fi movies back then couldn't even imagine getting that much money for the whole thing. If you take into account today's value, that's roughly $1.2 million. And all of it went into something that didn't move, blink, or talk on its own. But Robbie didn't just stay there. He blinked, moved, rotated, and talked while lights flashed and gears turned. His head was a dome made of plexiglass. There were revolving spheres, gyros, and pilot lights inside. Everything moved in time with him, as if he were alive. Frankie Darro, an actor, was the first person to get strapped in. It wasn't pretty. The robot was 7 feet tall and full of metal and rubber. The inside was pitch black, hot, and, music, suffocating. The head was partly electrified, and there was no airflow. Frankie once tried to film a scene after drinking a few martinis and almost knocked down the robot. The studio didn't find it funny. It hurt him to take every step. He was tired after every move. And all that pain never even made it to the screen. Robbie wasn't done even after the movie. MGM dispatched him all over the place because they needed to get their money back. In 1957, he gained his own leading part in The Invisible Boy. He then became a regular on shows like The Twilight Zone, Lost in Space, Columbo, The Addams Family, The Love Boat, and even More and Mindy. He was like an Easter egg that kept coming back in music. He would get new paint or new wires at times. But the shape never changed. In 2003, he even graced the screen with Bugs Bunny and the Looney Tunes. It wasn't a career of cameos. It was like a second life. People in Hollywood said he was the hardest working robot, music. But Robbie was more than just metal. He made rules. Dr. Morbius, the person who made him, told him exactly what to do, and those directions were in conformity with Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. No hurting others. Follow directions, keep himself safe, but never at the expense of the other 2 rules. The plot was formed by these rules. Robbie won't fight when the invisible ID monster attacks. His circuits are locked. He can't move because he knows the creature is part of Morbius. If he fights the beast, he fights his own master. It was one of the first times a robot in a movie followed not only orders but also morals. It revolutionized science fiction for good. Forbidden Planet did more than just that. First, it didn't have violins or trumpets in its music. It was constructed utilizing circuits. Louis and Baby Baron didn't play any instruments. They made their own machines. There were no strings or keys, only raw voltage and sound. It was the first movie to have a music score that was all electronic. It wasn't music in the background. It was the mood, the tension, and the environment. The Barents didn't even call it music. They termed it electronic tonalities because the American Federation of Musicians wouldn't let them call it music. The union said that if people didn't perform it with real instruments, it didn't count. So, even though they made something innovative, music, the Barents only earned second-tier recognition. The process was very hard. They couldn't use the circuits they made again. Each one had its own voice, personality, and lifespan. They recorded that last sound when a circuit ultimately overloaded and died. That scream of death was added to the music. B.E.B. Baron then had to go through hundreds of tape pieces, cutting and splicing them by hand. There was no undo button, no software, just tape, blades, and hours of practice. She subsequently said it was a dreadful job, but without her, the noises would have been lost. Every piece was different. Nothing could be made again. It wasn't merely an experiment for them. It was philosophical.
The barons thought of machines as more than just tools because of Norbert Wiener's notion of cybernetics.
They thought of them as living things in their own way. The circuits reacted to feedback. They changed. They altered over time. There was a start, a middle, and an end to each one. Because they believed it, their machines became co-creators. Every beep and screech was a moment of life that was caught before the circuit went out. The soundtrack murmured and hummed, but the monster on the screen screamed. The ID monster was not a man in a suit.
Joshua Meter, who had worked for Disney for a long time, animated it by hand.
Each frame was drawn on clear vellum, one at a time. It took a long time.
The monster was only a fiery silhouette that was hard to see unless it went through the ship's force shield. It was scary, frightening, and impossible to find.
State censors believed it was too scary. Some people wanted changes. An unseen creature didn't usually fight back like that. But this one really got to me. Maybe it wasn't a thing. It was just a notion. Freud came up with the idea. The beast was more than simply a menace. It was the mind itself.
The ID is the anger, lust, and fear that reside in every mind without being filtered.
Morbius didn't know he was making it.
He assumed the old Krell machine was safe, but it could read his mind. And not just the ones he told the police about, but also the ones he buried and the ones he didn't even know about. And those thoughts turned into weapons.
The Krell constructed machines that could make thoughts come true.
These machines were fueled by more than 9,000 thermonuclear reactors hidden deep in the ground.
But they never thought to put a restriction on the machine.
So the Krell died when their own fears came to life.
Every one of them. Almost the same event happened again in one night. Morbius used Krell technology. The beast came back when he got envious. That's why Robbie, music, couldn't stop it. That's why the guns didn't function.
They were trying to fight with someone's mind. Morbius was the monster. And his pain, his want, and his refusal. Everything made the monster more powerful.
Altaira wasn't safe either.
Morbius's daughter became the center of it all. Her innocence and her increasing love for Commander Adams.
It pulled on something inside of Morbius. Something went wrong. He never said it out loud. But the demon roared when Altaira kissed another man.
It wasn't Morbius who called it.
That was him.
His mind was fighting for control. The jealousy, the possessiveness, and the anger all came out in the most Freudian way. Later, movie critics picked out the incestuous connotations.
The monster didn't want to hurt Altaira. It wanted to keep her safe from everyone else. In the end, it harmed Morbius the most.